The Biden administration's executive order on AI. I've been sort of slow to get to this because honestly, I find it a little bit exhausting. Like, there's a lot in it, but it's missing a lot. And I just was kind of tired in looking at it for some reason. For those who don't know, I wrote this book, The Loop, How AI is Creating a World Without Choices and How to Fight Back. It's out in paperback right now. The New York Times says, a fascinating survey, called it a fascinating survey. The Washington Post, however, panned me and said that they were sick of this kind of hand-wringing. I've had other critics call me paranoid and speculative, but it turns out I was actually pretty conservative in the things I was worrying about here, because as this executive order lays out, there's a lot to worry about. The executive order, it basically directs about a dozen agencies to come up with some rules and systems for evaluating AI, trying to figure out how it works, what effects it'll have on labor, what effects it'll have on data privacy. And it directs, for instance, the FTC to look at consumer harms, or the Commerce Department to look at verification and watermarking. But, in a lot of ways, the fact that, what it really does, though, is it assumes that AI has to go forward for the good of the economy, that America is supposed to be a leader in this technology, and so it should just go forward, right? And that kind of, manifest destiny in tech is something that I have always taken issue with, and I definitely take issue with it in this book. And it's a particular bummer because there's so many smart people, because I try to be in touch with as many smart people about this stuff as I can, have pointed out to me, the horse is out of the barn in some really crazy ways that it suggests you really have to go catch the horse to solve. So one of them is already generative AI. If you've played around with chatgpt, you have sensed the way in which it makes connections between different categories of language. When it gets on a subject, it connects other pieces. It's constantly making these sort of statistical connections between the way words appear next to one another. And unfortunately, because it learns from the internet, if there's, racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or Islamophobic language on the internet, it's going to pick up the patterns in that stuff, and it begins to create these mathematical assumptions, these kinds of neural pathways, in a sense, in which, these lines are kind of etched in concrete, where it begins to get used to the idea of associating certain words with other words. And that's happening at a time when we have no ability to tell the difference between what's been made by AI and what hasn't. The companies that have created ChatGPT and the rest did not, along with those creations, release any kind of way to tell the difference. So, these are some big problems. And the complication with an executive order is that it doesn't carry the force of law. I mean, you can't prosecute on the basis of an executive order. What it does is it directs these agencies who are working for the White House to follow the orders. So the FTC is responsible for looking at consumer harms. Commerce is supposed to look for watermarking and verification, right? They in theory can bring what they can in terms of enforcement, but the penalties associated with this stuff, not clear. What happens if you turn in your paperwork to show that you're going to have only a beneficial effect on the labor market, and you're found to be lying? We don't know. Like, none of those rules have been made yet. This basically just says to these agencies, about a dozen of them, start coming up with some rules, come back to us and show them what they're going to be. Meanwhile, the European Union is sprinting ahead on regulating AI. Lots of people have take lots of issue with how they're doing it. Maybe so, but they're pretty well, they're trying to think it through, right? Meanwhile, here in the United States, when it comes to things like social media and free speech, we don't have any real policy. We're just grinding it out court case by court case. And I'm really curious to see whether this executive order is going to lead to some sort of like overarching kind of regulation, which, as I've argued, needs to take into account things like effects on human agency and the de-skilling of humans in these really fundamental ways, rather than just fighting it out in the courts, case by case by case, which is the model we've been following when it comes to social media and free speech. So lots to think about. I'm glad that there's some traction. Everybody I'm talking to is also glad that there's some traction, that we're moving forward a little bit, and that we're not going to be creating some new random agency, but actually giving it to existing agencies with some expertise. That's all good. The assumption that AI has to be part of our economy, we have to go forward with it, maybe not as good. So as with everything, it's complicated.